Salutations, gentle viewers. Behind me is 221B Baker Street. Perhaps the most famous detective's residence in the world. You can see the blue plaque on it. Trouble is, of course, it was not a real detective. Sherlock Holmes, a character invented by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in around about 1885. So his origins are obscure. Did he attend one of the English universities? One of the great ones. Was he a Metropolitan Police detective first of all? But certainly by the time we met him, he's about middle-aged, confirmed bachelor, and a consulting detective. So people come to him with all sorts of mysteries, and by power of logical reasoning, he can often figure out the answer without even leaving the room. And he'll often say the game is afoot. And he shares his flat with Dr. Watson, whom he met at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Dr. Watson used to be in the Royal Army Medical Corps, served in Afghanistan. So to unwind, Sherlock Holmes will play the violin. We don't know much about his family, but he has one brother, Mycroft, and he also relaxes by taking cocaine. And I think it's heroin as well, actually. Perhaps I should say opium. Anyway, in those days, these substances were entirely legal as recreational drugs. There were no restrictions on them. It was only in the 1920s these were restricted. They were produced in British India, marketed here, India, China, and elsewhere. So that's that. And we're perhaps moving towards decriminalisation now. So Sherlock Holmes is a fascinating character, and he has been portrayed in numberless films and television series. However, in the Arthur Conan Doyle novels, there is no mention of that deerstalker cap, which is an iconic item in relation to this character, nor is there indeed that, you call it hornbill pipe, or because it comes down over the chin, or indeed the Inverness cape. There's an American actor, Basil Rathbone, in the 1920s, or even before. He started playing Sherlock Holmes on stage and was wildly popular in the United States, and then portrayed him on film. And he made those props sine qua non of the role. And they're so closely identified with Sherlock Holmes that anybody who's doing a skit about a detective will put these things on. More recently, Benedict Cumberbatch played Sherlock Holmes, and he broke with the convention, and he did not use these items, which I think was terrible. So remember, Sherlock Holmes was a series of novels, perhaps I should say novellas. They're quite short, long before it was a play. So who was Arthur Conan Doyle? Well, he was a medical doctor. He was born in Edinburgh to parents of Irish extraction. He went to Stonyhurst College. He's brought up as a Roman Catholic, and he attended the University of Edinburgh. But he spent most of his professional life in London. He was a conservative in politics. He had no truck with Irish Home Rule. Not a terribly political person. And as I say, he's renowned for his fiction. He was knighted by King George V. Another thing is, Conan Doyle, he was a very firm believer in spiritualism, as in seances, a medium could contact a dead person and bring them back. The 1920s was the height of spiritualism. The First World War was just over. Millions of young men had been killed, and many people were distraught. They couldn't cope with this bereavement, and their way of handling the situation was to believe that they could communicate to someone who's on the other side. So Conan Doyle, as a physician, you might have thought was a bit more rational, but no, he went in for that nonsense. You can go to the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre in Edinburgh, which is named in his honour, and indeed seances go on there. There's a spiritualist church. Conan Doyle thought this was compatible with mainstream Christianity. So there is the museum. Now, when Conan Doyle penned these stories, this address did not exist. Baker Street's down here. But Baker Street only went up to something like number 80. And then this adjoining street was then renamed, and it became the extension of Baker Street. All of a sudden, that fictitious address, 221B Baker Street, did exist. And it was owned by Midland Bank. So Midland Bank laughed all the way to the bank, if you will, because then they were sold it, and then it's the museum, as you can see, and there's a queue all the way down the street. So you can go around these rooms, which are laid out as though it was Sherlock Holmes's house and his consulting room. What else? So the staggering thing is, they receive thousands upon thousands of emails and letters per year from people, including adults, who not only believe that Sherlock Holmes is a real person, they think he's still alive. and they ask him to solve their problems. It shows how suggestible some people are, and that many people cannot distinguish fact from fiction. And so you're free to read these if you go there, and you can write back to them if you want. So that's that. It's a bit on the pricey side. I once applied to be the policeman here at the Sherlock Holmes Museum. It said, we provide the uniform, you provide the personality. Well, I've got that in spades, as perhaps you can tell. So I'm going to have to wear a Victorian policeman's uniform, greet all the tourists. I could give them a smattering of a few languages. Unfortunately, when they got someone to do it, they hired the dullest person in the world. So I wasn't going to be a real police officer. They wanted someone who's a member of Equity, the actors union, to do it. Anyway, it's well worth going in. In the late 80s and early 90s, Jeremy Brett, he portrayed Sherlock Holmes, and they filmed some of the scenes in the house and indeed outside the house. So that was that. So Jeremy Brett is the Sherlock Holmes I grew up with. To me, he is Sherlock Holmes. He was also exceptionally popular in Russia. This character, you can see a statue of him on the banks of the Moscow River in front of the British Embassy. And in the 80s, the Soviet Union had its own Sherlock Holmes series because they promoted classic English literature. Right, that is the Sherlock Holmes Museum beside Baker Street Tube Station. Well worth paying a visit to.